Upon landing, this passenger disregarded the flight crew's order to honor a fallen soldier, stating loudly, "I couldn't care less about it." Little did he know that the person behind him would instantly make him regret uttering such a statement. "Sir, you have to wait." The flight attendant's voice cut through the chaos as the man, tall and rugged, pushed his way to the front of the aisle. "Move," he snapped, his impatience overriding any sense of decorum. But she stood her ground, blocking his path with a firmness that matched his aggression. "This is a sensitive moment. We need to let the fallen soldier be escorted off first." He glared at her, clearly weighing whether to argue. Meanwhile, the other passengers were already on their feet, ignoring the pleas to remain seated. The tension in the cabin thickened as the plane taxied to the gate, and the gravity of the situation was lost on those desperate to leave. As the pilot's voice from the transmitter faded away, the flight attendants reiterated the pilot's request again, their voices firm but respectful. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have a fallen soldier on board, a fallen airman. We ask you to remain seated as we pull into the gate so he can be escorted off the aircraft first." Unfortunately, their words fell on deaf ears. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the passengers' impatience grew. The fallen airman's escort, two somber-faced military officers, headed for the door, and that was when things began to take a wild turn. In a matter of seconds, most of the passengers got on their feet and followed suit, ignoring the plea to remain seated. Among them was a man who had been fidgeting in his seat since takeoff from Phoenix. The man was tall, had a rugged jawline, and appeared to be in his late 40s. He stood at the forefront of the aisle, waiting next in line behind the fallen airman's escort to disembark. However, before he could rush out, a flight attendant, visibly upset, stopped him in his tracks. "You have to wait, sir," she said firmly and politely. A hint of irritation flashed across his face as he stood face to face with the petite stewardess. Earlier on, he had a run-in with her, and his patience was wearing thin. With the journey finally over, he was eager to exit the plane quickly, just like the rest of the passengers behind him. Yet, this flight attendant stood in the way, adding to his already agitated state. That afternoon, as he stood before the door, he glanced around, seemingly annoyed that he was now the object of frustration for the impatient passengers who pushed against him. Irate, he shot a glare at the stewardess, as if hoping it would scare her off and give him room to pass. But she remained undeterred, returning his glare with the same intensity while repeating her order to stay seated. "I couldn't care less, honestly," the man hissed at the lady, drawing a few disapproving glances from the passengers who caught it. He didn't notice the attention he had unwittingly drawn to himself, especially from a certain fellow who sat behind him. And for the record, he didn't seem to care. All he wanted was to walk out of the plane. He had no idea that doing so would lead to a moment that would forever change his life. It was the summer of 2017, and the plane was bound for Detroit carrying a precious cargo, the body of Sergeant Andre Taylor, an airman who was being transported back to his home in Michigan. As the passengers settled into their seats, the pilot's voice resounded over the intercom, his tone soft and somber. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special passenger on board today. We're honored to be transporting the remains of Sergeant Andre Taylor, who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. We ask that you all remain respectful and silent during the flight." Sergeant Andre Taylor was an airman stationed at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix. He was born in Lansing, Michigan, and served in the U.S. Air Force for 10 years until he passed away at the age of 28. His family was working on taking him home to Michigan so they could finish the final funeral preparations when unexpected drama was forming in the distance. It's not always the case that fallen soldiers are transported in grand style by cargo or Delta Force planes as depicted in movies. They can sometimes be flown home on regular commercial planes with people on board. This was precisely the case for the late sergeant. His family, which consisted of his mother, siblings, and children Adriana and Aiden, had been waiting for this moment for weeks, their hearts heavy with grief. They had said their goodbyes at the military base, surrounded by Sergeant Taylor's fellow soldiers who blew taps for the last time in his honor. Now, through this trip, they were one step closer to laying their beloved Andre to rest. Sergeant Andre Taylor was surrounded by love from everyone: his colleagues in the Air Force, his family, and even the flight crew, who called for a solemn trip. However, not everyone on board shared this love for reverence for the fallen soldier. After the pilot had passed his message across, Mr. Johnson, a passenger in seat 17C, scoffed less than graciously. He found the information a bit unnecessary, as he was eager to get to his destination. Before takeoff, the pilot made another quick announcement about the need to maintain decorum during the trip, with the fallen soldier's family on board and still in mourning. The flight crew wanted to try their best to ensure a smooth experience for everyone on board. Yet, Mr. Johnson still didn't share this sentiment, finding the special treatment excessive. The near 50-year-old man huffed in annoyance before grumbling under his breath, "What's the big deal? Other people have their own problems to deal with." The words were muttered quickly, barely a whisper, making everyone around him miss it. Everyone, that is, except Martha, the petite stewardess who had been going around urging the passengers to buckle up properly. A flicker of disgust flashed across her face for a millisecond before she expertly schooled her expression to one befitting of a flight attendant. With a small smile on her face, she urged Mr. Johnson to switch off his phone and buckle up. In response, the man grumbled once again, yet did as instructed. For a brief moment, he caught Martha's subtle show of annoyance, but chose to ignore it. He had a 4-hour flight to sit through and wasn't in the mood for drama. Barely after takeoff, once everyone had settled down, the plane's engines roared to life, and the vessel soared through the air in a matter of minutes. While in the air, the pilot's voice echoed through the intercom at intervals. Like before, he reiterated his directive for the passengers to honor the late sergeant. However, this time his messages were for a different kind of tribute. "Ladies and gentlemen, please listen to this announcement. Upon landing, we'll be asking you to remain seated until the body of Sergeant Taylor is respectfully removed from the aircraft." Following this announcement, the flight attendants often repeated the request, their eyes scanning the cabin with solemn determination. It was important that they set the right ambiance for the trip, so they went on routine checks around the cabin. Amidst this awe-inspiring scenery, Mr. Johnson grew more disconcerted by the constant reminders. He digested the information with mild annoyance, without putting any effort into hiding his discomfort. His behavior didn't go unnoticed. Martha, who had been keeping a watchful eye on him, sensed his displeasure from a mile away. Quickly, she approached him with a warm smile, eager to determine the source of his discomfort. True to his arrogant self, Mr. Johnson wasted no time questioning the need for the constant reminders, citing them as too much and unnecessary. The remark came off as a slight slap to Martha, yet she fought the urge to let annoyance mask her face. "Sir, I understand it may seem repetitive, but we have a lot of passengers on board who may not be paying attention," she explained, gesturing toward some passengers busy with magazines, while others watched movies or laughed at entertaining content on their phones. "We're only trying to create a respectful atmosphere for the family of Sergeant Taylor." Martha hoped her words were sensible enough to appeal to the inconsiderate man, but to her surprise, they didn't seem to have any effect on him. If anything, it only pushed him to utter more insensitive statements. Scoffing at her, he stated, "I don't see the point of such an extended gesture. After all, nobody is going to get up from their seats to dance or cheer suddenly. It's a long trip and we can't keep hearing this on and on, you know," he concluded, his eyes not betraying the irritation laced in his words. Martha's smile faltered, her mind reeling from what she had just heard. She took a few calming breaths to control herself, careful not to talk or act rashly that afternoon. Then, when she felt more in control, she finally gave a response, her voice polite but firm. "I understand your frustration, sir, but it's basic courtesy and protocol. So please, for the duration of the trip, do well to maintain a nice atmosphere and keep the peace." The exchange left a sour taste in Mr. P. Johnson's mouth, but he reluctantly agreed to comply for the rest of the trip. The flight crew repeated the reminder 4 times, especially as the mood in the plane began to look a little too unruly for comfort. At long last, their 4-hour trip finally came to a halt. Instead of letting the passengers disembark, Martha stood in Mr. Johnson's way. What Mr. Johnson hadn't realized was that the flight attendant was also internally fuming. They had been informed countless times during the trip to wait until Sergeant Andre Taylor's body was respectfully removed from the aircraft first. Yet here she was, trying to tame an arrogant man and a bunch of insensitive passengers who stood behind him. As if that wasn't enough disrespect, the man downplayed the sacredness of the entire display, stating he couldn't care less about it. His choice of words irked Martha more than she could admit. From the few glances she saw several passengers shoot at Mr. Johnson, she could tell that they shared her sentiments. Unable to control the increasingly agitated crowd walking down the aisle, Martha regrettably knew she had to relinquish her spot by the door. The young woman realized she was fighting a losing battle against Mr. Johnson and other passengers. Moreover, if she continued to stop them, she risked worsening the situation, allowing oblivious passengers to ruin the sacredness of the entire procedure. Mr. Johnson saw how her resolve was helplessly waning and smirked, finding the sight delightful. Although they never had a full-on confrontation that day, he was overcome with the urge to spite her for trying to talk down to him. Seeing her crumble after putting up a bold front was a blessing to him. Little did he know, he had another problem on his plate that was more deserving of his time and effort. You see, after he uttered those insensitive words, inaudible to most, they caught the attention of someone behind him. That person was Ken Fitzgerald, a retired airman who also worked as an airline staff member. Having been in the Air Force, he knew how sacred this moment was, not just for the fallen soldier who had served his country, but also for his family who brought him home to lay to rest. Fitzgerald's eyes were fixed on Mr. Johnson's head the minute he uttered his insensitive remark. Seated quietly, following the directive to remain silent and respectful upon landing, Fitzgerald never expected the passengers to act so discourteously, despite the numerous pleas. He watched as a woman shunned Mr. Johnson for his rude remark, citing it as an insult to the deceased and those who took the time to honor him. The woman, seated not far from Mr. Johnson, had visible gray strands of hair scattered around, indicating her age. Yet, Mr. Johnson did not find her advice worth his attention. Instead, he shrugged it off arrogantly before facing the stewardess once again. Mr. Johnson was about to exit the plane when Fitzgerald decided that he couldn't let this behavior slide. Taking a deep breath, he called out to Mr. Johnson, aiming to address him not as an airline staff member, but as a fellow citizen and veteran. "Excuse me, sir, but you can't act like that," Fitzgerald called out from where he was sitting, hoping to get Mr. Johnson's attention. However, just like the others who had spoken to him, Mr. Johnson looked over his shoulder in the most casual way possible before blatantly ignoring him. Through this act, he never gave Fitzgerald the chance to properly educate him on what he was doing wrong. Before more could be said on the matter, Mr. Johnson exited the plane, leaving behind a host of unresolved tensions. Fitzgerald was flabbergasted by the sheer display of disregard he had just witnessed, not just from Mr. Johnson, but also from the other passengers who had disembarked while Sergeant Taylor's family wept over the casket. Feeling the flames of anger and disappointment burn within him, Fitzgerald decided that he would make sure Mr. Johnson and the other discourteous passengers understood the gravity of their actions and the respect due to Sergeant Taylor and his family. Mind you, the retired airman wasn't planning revenge. He wanted to educate. Fitzgerald recorded the scene and shared the clip online once he got home. In a Facebook post, he expressed grave disappointment over the passengers' disregard for such a sensitive moment, citing multiple instances in which the flight attendants called out the passengers' behavior but were rudely ignored. In one instance, he recounted how a flight attendant behind him urged two departing passengers that if they didn't have the courtesy to stay seated, they should at least stop laughing as they walked down the aisle. In a follow-up video post, Fitzgerald divulged that only he, a flight attendant, an off-duty pilot, and the Delta Airlines flight crew remained seated until Sergeant Taylor's coffin was loaded into a hearse. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," he said, his tone conveying the bitterness he had felt earlier that day. "I talked to the flight attendant sitting behind me, and we were questioning whether we missed something in the flight crew's instructions." Fitzgerald also expressed that although he found the situation appalling, he could understand that some passengers were simply ignorant of its gravity. They had flown for close to 4 hours, so some passengers might have needed a break to stretch and step onto solid ground. He cited one woman with arthritis who needed to stand as a valid example, stating he completely understood her urgent need to disembark the plane. Likewise, he understood that there could have been a list of other valid reasons why the passengers wanted to leave so quickly. Perhaps some had connecting flights to catch, medical or personal matters to attend to, or maybe they thought it was okay to get off the plane after the military escorts departed. Those could have been good enough reasons for their discourteous behavior that day. But were they excusable? Since it's not every day that one travels with the casket of a fallen soldier, not everyone could have been familiar with the formalities of honoring them. However, no matter how much one could sugarcoat it, the apparent lack of courtesy still stuck out like a sore thumb on this particular flight. There have been instances in the past where passengers received their first-time experience traveling with a fallen soldier. In fact, a similar case occurred about 4 years earlier when the remains of a deceased U.S. Army soldier were on board a Delta flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles. On that plane, passengers showed the utmost respect for the deceased and his family, with some getting emotional in the process. With such an example existing in contrast, it was difficult to excuse this particular Phoenix-Detroit flight. In conclusion, the retired airman reiterated his disappointment with the passengers that day, repeating that he shared his videos to educate those who were not aware of proper customs and courtesies. No matter how spoon-fed the instructions were on this flight, the passengers seemed to ignore them. Fitzgerald's posts went viral within minutes, catching the attention of various news outlets and bloggers who bemoaned the lack of respect and civility displayed by passengers at airports. Quickly, they helped to disseminate the lessons Fitzgerald was trying to share. In addition to the media and military communities, a well-known corporate company also found the video enlightening. This led to an interesting, life-changing decision for some of the passengers on board, especially Mr. Johnson, who was on a business trip for said company. Following a thorough review of eyewitness statements and evidence regarding Mr. Johnson's behavior, the company took swift action against their employee. First, they revoked his frequent flyer privileges, demoting his employee status pending a comprehensive review of his case. Furthermore, the company mandated that Mr. Johnson attend sensitivity training and take a course on respecting military personnel and their families. Failure to comply with this ruling would result in severe consequences, including a 6-month temporary suspension or permanent termination. Although this part of the incident wasn't disclosed to the general public, only the flight crew, including Fitzgerald and Martha, got wind of it. The news came as a relief to them, as it signaled that Mr. Johnson would not be in their hair anytime soon. With the dust settling, the flight crew went about their routine, putting the sad event behind them. Despite the outrage it sparked, there was a silver lining in the process. Sergeant Taylor's family received immense support from people who sympathized with them. I was saddened by the disrespect people displayed on the plane that day, but now I'm just so overwhelmed by the love and support my brother and family have received because of that disrespect, the fallen soldier's sister, Tiffany Dobson, told Fitzgerald. It has really helped my family get through this hard time. For what it's worth, the passengers' actions opened streams of endless outpourings of emotions like never before in Sergeant Taylor's home. What an enlightening story. There are several lessons from this event for us to take home. First, always respect the dead regardless of your emotions or circumstances, even if you're having a bad day. Second, honor our fallen soldiers who have paid the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom. And most importantly, refrain from making insensitive remarks about veterans in public, as it can have severe consequences, especially when there's a retired soldier around. Unfortunately, Mr. Johnson learned these lessons the hard way. Do you think the punishments meted out to him were too much or not nearly enough? Also, what are your thoughts on Fitzgerald's message about airplane etiquette? Let us know in the comments below. We learn every day, and through this event, we hope you learned something today. Thank you for watching, and see you in our next video.